Hi, folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Friendly Council. We're again here, and Miha, our host, has brought an amazing guest. Hello, Miha.
Hello. Yes, we have Steven today. Steven was my teammate in the 8 Regions event in Team Baratheon, so I think this episode will mainly be about Baratheon. Right, Steven?
Oh, definitely. But, a slightly different shade of yellow. Maybe, closer to the orange side, I'd say. But yeah, we can call that Baratheon.
Alright, so what deck are we building today?
So, we're building a Martell deck, not a Baratheon deck, unfortunately. Um, we're going to be going with Martell Valyrian Steel. Uh, a deck that holds slightly good place in my heart, as it's one of the last decks I was able to play at a physical tournament in Australia before that scene was completely, wiped away due to COVID. Uh, so always a good deck for me.
It's really nice. Alex also presented a deck near to his heart for Greyjoy. So we
Mm.
have another heartwarming deck with Martell. Martell is always heartwarming, I would say,
Oh yeah,
of
yeah, yeah,
course.
yeah. That's why it's
All
the
right.
sun. It's warm, right?
So
Yeah,
Martell Valyrian Steel is not the most typical combination. So
Mm.
I'm looking forward to how it will work.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to explaining it. So, yep. So we start off with Valyrian Steel. I guess I can get into the cards themselves.
Mhm.
Um, well, Valyrian Steel itself, obviously we're going to be focusing a lot on attachments here. Martell, they have a very good mixture of control attachments, but lately, and these are more recent additions I made, um, they've actually got a few more good positive attachments, such as like Sword of the Morning, recently that have really fit this deck and what it's trying to do. Um, it's a good mix of control of important lords and lady characters, and it utilizes a really interesting mechanic that I will get into later. That I only realized the other week, which got me, uh, excited again for this deck, in a way that I wouldn't think of. Um, so with that, I would say it's probably best to start with the characters. That's all right,
Mhm.
as it would be better to explain everything as we go. So this is one of the few decks that plays one of my favorite cards. Three copies of Doran Martell from Sands of Dawn. So Icon Doran Martell. And the
Uh,
reason why just hearing that response is reminds me this is the right choice. um, this deck is primarily about control, and when you hear the word control and more specifically icon control, you definitely go with this Doran Martell. Um, he also complements a bunch of the other cards in this deck. Uh, that we will get into later. But we'll start off with the icon control package from the character's point of view. So we've got three copies of Dawn Martell. We'd also pack in three copies of Dawnish Spy, I think for fairly obvious reasons. Um, there are other cards, Ambush works very well in this deck, but there are also other cards that can help put that card into play. Uh, we also have Shadow City Bastard and Southern Messenger. Again, two very key cards to most icon removal decks. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, ambush here in this deck just works very, very well. So anything with ambush and icon removal is a great plus. Um, to complement things like Southern Messenger and a few other cards we'll get into later, this deck actually runs three copies of the Fowler twins as well. Um, uh,
mhm.
forcing your opponents into challenges, as I mentioned before with Sword of the Morning, for example, that's going to be a fairly prevalent thing in this deck. So three copies of Foul Twins, they're a fantastic cost for what you're trying to do there. Um, Now I'll probably get into some of the other lords and ladies because I did mention that was a thing here, and so if you see 3 copies of Dawn Martell, you know you also have to have 3 copies of Malaria of Novos
Absolutely.
for fairly obvious reasons. The second that she's on the board and Dawn's on the board, your biggest card is protected. Well, from plots, of course, but primarily protected in the biggest way that he's going to die, which is like a Vala Morgulis or a Vala D. This is also a deck that can actually utilize Malaria 100%. So we have Dawn Martell, obviously. We will also have 2 copies of Ariane Martell, poor Ariane Martell, that is. As I mentioned, with like Dornish Spy and a lot of ambush cards, she's a very obvious solution here to help get those cards into play. And then we have 1 copy of Tristan Martell from Bran the Builder, and 1 copy of Quinton Martell from Sands of Dawn. Tristan, you know, combine Tristan with a Shadow City Bastard, or with, as you can probably assume, the plethora of I guess with because it's Valyrian still, the small pool of Martell icon control attachments, he can really do some nasty work. And there's actually a nice little combo that I'll talk about with him later on. And Quinton Martell is just there as he's a fantastic body for the cost. And this deck does utilize use plot tech just a little bit, so he does still fit in here quite easily. We'll then move on to another staple icon control card. So, but it is just 1 copy of Nymeria Sand. That's the Road to Winterfell Nymeria, of course. And then along with that as well, 1 copy of Sands of Dawn Abara Sand, for similar reasons to, Ariane Martell, an easy way to get those cheaper characters into play at key moments. And yeah, Nymeria, it's pretty obvious why she's there. Now, going back to one of my favorite cards, this card here is definitely up on that list for me, and I always struggle to find a deck where he works in, but it definitely does work here. It's Oberyn's Revenge, the Red Viper.
Oh, I love him. It's my favorite Red Viper, I have to say.
Yes, yes,
Amazing. Yeah, really cool card. It's also, I think, a really good design because he can be amazingly strong, but it's also not super easy. Basically, it's not a trigger, but to get his condition to work in your favor. So yeah, I like it.
definitely. Yeah. In this deck here, it has enough of those different icon control elements that, or more specifically, surprise icon control, which is the subtle way that he has to work most of the time. That he works quite well. So, as you can probably tell with Alaria and what I've hinted at with sort of the morning, you've got options of either pulling your opponent into challenges with their 1 icon characters, or there are other options to surprise your opponent with icon control after they choose to defend. So, this Red Viper is a fantastic choice for those reasons, and every time I see him, I get happy. So that's fantastic. Did I mention 1 copy of Alaria Sand? I can't remember. I feel like I just mentioned it there.
You did not.
Okay, well, 1 copy of Alaria Sand. That's Sands of Dawn, Alaria Sand. Again, same reason for. Oh no, I mentioned Fowler Twins before. That's right. Same reasons for like with Fowler Twins and Sword of the Morning. Just a very solid card to help pull those characters into play. Bit expensive in this scenario, but 1 copy of her. If you see her, you're always fairly happy. Then there's 4 more characters that we'll get into. Mostly 1 copy of Core Area Hotar, and he's just a good card in this deck. It's not really working too well towards icon control or something else, but everyone likes a cheeky Area Hotar every now and then. I know my opponents always do. And then filling in for some of the Chud characters of this deck, you've got 3 copies of Desert Scavenger, 3 copies of Greenblood Trader, and 2 copies of Housestane Escort. That should be all 35 characters, a high character count, but it is a Valyrian Steel deck, so yeah.
So far, if I understood it correctly, the characters really support the 2 themes that Martell has with respect to icon control and
Yep.
drawing in characters against their will. So It's
Definitely.
interesting and evil combination. So
That's definitely true, and it's why I mentioned that this Red Viper works so well in those scenarios, as well as every other card there to support that idea. Just that Red Viper sort of encompasses the two themes of this deck into one card really well.
Did you say 35 characters?
Yes, I'm guessing you've possibly missed one that I've said.
I have 37, so it's 2 copies
Oh,
of Shadow City Bastard and Southern Messenger, right? I think I
yep,
added 3 by mistake there. Yeah, so
yep.
I was actually quite interested about the numbers here because Valyrian Steel obviously says you have to have 75 cards, so I was wondering how that would then scale with the other card types, because if you have something like 35 in a 60 card deck, then if you would increase all the card types by about the same level, then you would get a few more, I guess. But you are using the agenda to get through your deck quicker, I am guessing here, by drawing cards more than by gaining gold.
Yes. So yes. So it tries to balance the four card types fairly well, or fairly evenly. Keeping in mind that you will have to have a lot more attachments for the agenda to actually do its thing. And we do have solutions for draw later on, and I might get to that a bit later as well, because there's a very key decision to make if you were to play this deck and if you wanted to tweak it a little bit that I have run into in the past, completely related to in regards to draw and finding the right cards in that way. But yeah, it tries to balance those four card types fairly well here. 35 characters is a little bit low, but there are ways to repeat the characters that you see on the board. So yeah, shall I move on to attachments?
Okay, this should be interesting.
Yes. So here's the interesting part of the deck for sure. So obviously all these attachments will be one copy. And we will be going into one copy of all four icon removal attachments, being Beguiled, Imprisoned, Attainted, and Condemned. Now, I feel like explaining these is fairly obvious, just fits the deck very well. And one important thing here is I mentioned earlier with the Red Viper that surprise icon removal is very important with him. For if you don't find those challenge pull abilities, then you have to surprise your opponent after they defend. Valyrian Steel can uniquely do that for you by surprising your opponent with an icon removal attachment when usually you can't ambush that card. So that's where this agenda starts to shine when you start to surprise your opponent with these control cards like that. So we'll move on to other control cards just in general. You've always got to have one copy of Milk of the Poppy. That's fairly obvious. Uh, Martell have a fantastic control card in the form of Secret Pact. Here it's really, really useful both for obviously its effect, but it's another ambush card. And later on we'll get into, ways for you to utilize ambush cards a little bit better. But, just the fact that it has ambush is very useful. Keep that in mind. We'll then move on to Lingering Venom, just a generally useful card, primarily because it's zero cost, but it can also have the potential to kill an opponent. Zero cost attachments are fantastic as it's a free trigger of Valyrian Steel. Speaking of zero cost attachments, we've got Reckless and Sweet Sleep. Sweet Sleep, I guess, could be considered both a positive and a negative attachment, depending on who it's on. In this scenario here, it is always useful finding a Sweet Sleep and just putting it onto. I know I found a lot of use putting onto like Malaria of Norvos, for example, just to keep her a little bit protected in protecting other cards as well. Or of course, like Dawn Martell to prevent a Milk of the Poppy or something big. There are some cards where it doesn't work with, like Icon Viper, for example. Generally, you want to be stacking other attachments onto him, so yeah, you got to watch out for Sweet Sleep. It can bite you in the back. And then I would say the final control card would be Seized by the Guard. Again, just a fantastic form of control here. Not really any bestow tech or anything, but fairly obvious why it's in there for location control. With that, we can probably move on to the more positive, the more fun, nicer attachments for your opponent. So one copy of Bodyguard seems pretty straightforward here. There's a lot of lords and ladies that you can protect. There is also a very subtle interaction where if you chuck Bodyguard onto Ariane Martell, using it to trigger your Valyrian Steel agenda, when you return her to hand, you obviously get that Bodyguard back, ready to re-trigger the agenda next turn. It's not always relevant, but in scenarios where you're choked for attachments, you're not drawing as many attachments as you can, it can be surprisingly useful being able to reuse that Bodyguard multiple times. There's that. There is also our Seal of the Hand and Sword of the Morning, two very, very good 3-cost attachments in this scenario. You know, I've had multiple scenarios where I've had the Red Viper with Seal of the Hand and Sword of the Morning, and my opponent's just conceded because that's just terrible times. Where none of their opponents get to stand really, or get to participate in challenges properly. So that's great in itself. We then have one copy of Core Dawn, obviously the attachment Dawn. Again, similar reasons. This has a bit of used plot tech in this, so Dawn is just going to be relatively useful. And another strength pump card, Hotar's Axe. Again, similarly, just works with a lot of the, ambush or put into play characters that you've got in this deck. And importantly, it's another free trigger of Valyrian Steel by putting it into play for free. So that's always nice. We've got 3 more attachments. We've got Water Dancer's Sword. Again, similar reasoning to something like Bodyguard, the Bodyguard scenario I mentioned. It's just another reusable attachment, and it can go on to a lot of characters you have in this deck. We have, technically this is a negative one. We have Venomous Blade, of course. I can't believe I forgot about that one. Everybody loves Venomous Blade. I won't take any other opinions on that card. But yeah, obviously you can things like Ariane Martell, you can reuse that card very well. And here is my very fun attachment that I've been trialing for a while, and it's always been useful. One copy of Patience, Sands of Dawn Patience.
Okay, that's a
Now,
first.
yes. So this is an attachment that on the surface it looks kind of mediocre, but being able to surprise it with Valyrian Steel, and once you find Patience, you are effectively able to reuse any of your enter play reactions. That's Ario Hotar, Dornish Spy, Tristane Martell, Southern Messenger, Greenblood Trader as well. You're just able to very easily reuse those cards and trigger Valyrian Steel at the same time. Even sometimes marshalling on those cards is just useful in itself. Having Patience on a card that has an enter player reaction can really throw your opponent off, because at any point you can return that to your hand and then reuse it if you have the gold or Ariane Martell or Ibarra Sand. A very underrated card in my mind, especially for this deck. So it's very nice here when you see it. And that should be all 18 attachments.
Uh,
Nice.
17.
17. Oh
What
no.
did we
Okay.
miss again?
I'll just list them out for you.
Okay, so I forgot to add patience, even though I had it on screen for about a minute.
You were being patient about it. That's fair enough.
Okay, so we can just quickly see if there's anything that stands out here that you did not include. Let me just have a quick look. So
I would have a question on that, Stephen. So
Yeah.
one thing, when I tried to play Matilda Valyrian Steel, not
Mhm.
very successfully, was Locked Away, and it would also be a
Yes.
control card. So what's your thinking on that?
So Locked Away, it is a very interesting card, and I'll be honest, it's probably worthwhile testing it in this version of the deck, and I can get to that a little bit later as to why that's the case. But it's a card where, in my mind, it's doing a lot of what other characters are already doing, but it's not giving you anything more than just doing that effect. So, for example, I know they're not, they can technically be saved here, but you've got those Tristane Martells and Southern Messengers that are already bouncing back to hand. Um, it is still a very good way to, if you're able to do this in the one of the later phases, maybe just before the standing phase for next turn, or even in the draw phase somehow, it's always good. It does require, if you want to get full effectiveness out of it, I would say you'd want to be using it in the draw phase, and that does require your plots to properly reflect, make sure that you have that gold available to trigger Valyrian Steel and put it into play and bounce that person immediately. It requires your plot line to fit that, and this current iteration doesn't have that sort of plot line. So if you do have those, like, trading with the trade routes, and what's the character one?
Calling the
Calling the
banners.
banners.
That's the one. If you have cards like that, then Locked Away makes more sense. So you can, use it in its most efficient manner. But outside of that scenario, it wasn't finding as much use.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah, just looking through the attachments. One more that stands out to me, Strangler. I've seen used a lot with Valyrian Steel because you can put it into play mid-challenge to basically win one.
Yes. Yeah, so Strangler was actually the last one that I cut in this deck. So it's definitely one that you can slot in. You just need to figure out what else you want to take out. For me, it actually competed with that Patience slot, and actually, to me, it proved more useful. Patience proved more useful. It's definitely not to say the Strangler is a bad card in this scenario. It's really, really good, but yeah, generally, if your deck is doing its thing correctly, you're going to either be locking your opponents out of those challenges completely, or you don't want them to have low strength. You want them to have high strength, so you can kneel them all with your, forcing defenders cards and trigger lose to win conditions. Like, we'll have Dawn later on, as I mentioned, things like that to help you win that. So even though it is useful, it's the 19th attachment, I would say, in this deck.
Okay.
There were other minor considerations as well. I did consider the Mountain Skull as well, primarily as it's a unique card that could potentially trigger in the plot phase, for example, to get a really interesting Valyrian Steel trigger. And outside of that, it's just a, +2 strength and gaining renown is always great if you have the 3 gold to pay for that attachment. But similar to Strangler, it wasn't as useful as other cards. So I would say, the Strangler is the next light card, and the Mountain Skull, I think, was just below that. So they had to make the cut, unfortunately.
All right. So it
Okay.
would then be locations, right?
Yes, so we'll move on to locations. I was talking earlier about use plot tech, and you can see that there are quite a few expensive attachments. Sorry, so you can obviously assume Martell's going to utilize the water gardens. So we have 3 copies of the water gardens, which is sometimes unconventional, but it really does make sense here. You want to find that location as quickly as possible, because once you do, that water gardens converts itself into either an extra gold on top of the economy that it's saving you, an extra gold because of Valyrian Steel, or an extra card because of Valyrian Steel. So one cost card converting into, economy and those 2 extra things for free sounds like a fantastic idea. And it's very useful here.
Yeah.
The second staple location, which is one of the very recent additions that I've been loving, is Brand the Builder Sunspear. So 3 copies of that fit this deck. One obvious reason and one subtle reason. There's a lot of lords and ladies in this deck, or at least enough lords and ladies for it to make sense. A few of them being lords and ladies that you'll want to be jumping in and out of play, primarily looking at Ariane Martell and Tristan Martell, if you can find that patience. I know it's a 1 in 75 chance, but it does happen. Otherwise, it's giving you a passive one extra gold. The reason I really like it is it actually works with Valyrian Steel. So the action for Valyrian Steel, you can pay the gold on Sunspear because you're spending gold as if it was in your gold pool. So it's an extra reserve to help chuck in those Valyrian Steel attachments. So your opponent will see you have 0 gold and then be baffled as to how you just brought in that Sword of the Morning from your hand for 3 gold because you took the money off of Sunspear.
Nice.
That's interesting. So Sunspear works during the challenges phase. I was thinking when you mentioned it that maybe you were trying to actually get it to trigger in 3 different phases here. So it's kind of like the Tyrell High Tower where you expect to marshal something and then ambush something, so you get 2 triggers. But here you would get something in marshalling, then something in with ambush in the challenges phase, and maybe you use Valyrian Steel in the 3rd phase just to build up that economy. But I'm guessing mostly you're doing the Valyrian Steel triggers in challenges, if you can.
Yeah, unless like, it depends on what you find really. So some cards, if you find those ambush attachments like Venomous Blade and Secret Pact, you can, and you have Water Gardens, for example, you can just naturally do it yourself, and you don't have to rely on Valyrian Steel. And then it saves you being able to use that Valyrian Steel in another phase, because as we know with the redesigned Valyrian Steel, you want to try to spread out those reactions amongst your phases. Well, Sunspear is trying to do the same thing. So if you have the opportunity to spread those reactions out, you want to do that. So in multiple times, for example, I had like an icon attachment that didn't really matter in the challenges phase that I would Valyrian Steel in the dominance phase with just a 1 gold that I had left over, trigger Valyrian Steel, trigger Sunspear just for the sake of it. So yeah, and but in the scenarios where you don't have those ambush cards or you want to, put in a card without ambush, yeah, Sunspear is just going to be triggering the challenges phase as well.
Yeah, and I think we have an opportunity here to address something also that I read, particularly in the Iron Throne chat lobby a lot. People are saying that Sunspear is really bad. It's one of the worst of these 5-cost strongholds. But I think anytime I've played against it, and I haven't actually played with it that much, but when I play against it, it always seems to hold its own just fine. I think your experience has been similar, has it not?
Yes, yeah, it's definitely it's been worth it in my mind. It's been great in my mind, for sure.
Yeah, so on Sunspear, I would make the distinction. It might not be the most spectacular because it's just another gold reserve, but I also think it might not be the strongest, but I also don't think it's the worst one. So I think it's a nice one, and it's really interesting how you're using it here.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll be entirely honest. I actually discovered this reaction or this interaction completely by accident. I was playing online and I thought, oh, I'll chuck in 1 copy of the new Sunspear. I have Lords and Ladies. Let's see how it goes. And then when I triggered Valyrian Steel, it's like, why can I choose up to 5 gold worth? Sorry, up to 3 gold worth of characters when attachments when I have 1 gold. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Sunspear. And so from there, it shot, and it's always been useful whenever I find it. Obviously, things like Water Gardens as well make it a lot more affordable as well. So following Sunspear, we then have 2 copies of Dawn, obviously redesigned Dawn. This is just for obvious reasons. It's a very useful card here. You want to try to you're going through a 75 card deck. It's one of the draw cards that you just want to keep on, cycling through, finding the right cards you need, finding those combos that work. It's there. You could very easily fit 3 copies here. For me, I've skimmed it down to 2, just as I have found other draw cards are also working just as well. And I've been trying to test 1 or 2 other cards here and there, and bringing Dawn down by 1 I haven't really found it as much of a problem. It's not as integral as it needs to be. Following that, we're talking about icon control and all of that. So we've got Starfall, 1 copy of Starfall, everyone's favorite 3-cost location. This is all for obvious reasons. It's sort of surprise icon control, but at the same time it isn't. It's just so versatile in this scenario. I'd considered bumping that up to 2 as well, but trying to keep that deck at 75. You're already going through a lot of cards. You don't want to overdo it. And one of the plots will make sense as to why this is a low count as well. We then will move into 1 copy of Isle of Ravens. This card isn't necessarily integral to the deck. I've just found it simply useful. with reusing some of the, having the chance to reuse some of these events, but also there's a few terminal attachments that seeing multiple copies of here is actually quite beneficial for you. Uh, and considering you have one copy of all these attachments, finding more is just better. But that is one location that it's a bit of a flexible spot in this deck, so you can take that out for something else if you'd like. And then the remainder of the economy package, as along with Water Guard and Sunspear, of course, we have 3 copies of Summersea Port and 3 copies of Blood Orange Grove. Both, fairly straightforward reasons. They're just good economy in this deck.
Mhm.
Okay.
Seems almost a little short on economy. So are Water Gardens and Valyrian Steel doing the job there?
Yeah. So this deck has a very clear economy shortage because there's cards that I've noticed that are actually doing that for me. One being, if you fall short in your economy, you have Valyrian Steel. We will have an economy plot that works fairly well, and we'll have an economy event as well. But the whole point of Valyrian Steel in my mind is it's meant to balance out your deck. If you fall short of your draw cards but you have economy, Valyrian Steel is going to cover that for you. If you fall short of your economy cards and you have other cards that you're drawing and you can't play, Valyrian Steel is going to help cover you in that scenario as well. So I've noticed that this balance of economy does work surprisingly well. But I can understand why someone would maybe want to put 1 or 2 more economy cards in there, but I haven't really found the need for it thus far.
Yeah, interesting.
Probably good to move on to the events now as well. Now, most of these, sorry, just to make sure there's 16 locations as well, in case we missed one.
Yes, we got it right this time.
Perfect. So we've got 6 events. Now, some of these events I would say are quite flexible. So Martell have a plethora of good events they can use in this scenario. These are just most of the ones that I found have become the most useful lately for me, but it can always be adjusted based on the meta. So 1 copy of Emission in Essos. Now this might be a bit of a wonder as to why, but 1 copy of this card has been surprisingly useful when trying to find a key lord or lady. So, for example, if you find your 7-cost Doran Martell, but you need to start seeing a win condition later on, that mission to Essos can return him to hand, fetch you 6-cost Red Viper. If you're very desperate and you need to bounce someone back to hand, or you need something you need to prevent an opponent to prevent a character from, being in play, I guess. You could return something like Red Viper to fetch Tristan Martell as a surprise trigger for him. Similarly, it can also just simply be used, similar to Patience, to just return a card to hand. Because the way that it's worded, if you don't find that trait, that card just is returned to hand. Unless if it's cancelled, of course. Oh, sorry. It's also useful if you got Doran Martell on the field, for example, and you're looking to save him from a potential reset. Bounce Ariane Martell back to hand to find Malaria of Norvos. Same thing with Alaria Sand, finding either Namiria Sand or Avara Sand, or even one of those finding a Shadow City Bastard. There's a lot of what I like to call cascading traits in this deck that just 1 copy of this attachment can find itself useful in a game. So that's there for that reason. Now, you were talking about economy before. This deck, one of the recent additions I've made, and this is based on one of the RL changes, is I put in 1 copy of Indoran's name. I haven't had a lot of opportunities to test this, but it just does make sense. You've got a bit of that use plot tech here, and you're sacrificing 1 trigger of Valyrian Steel action to likely gain yourself like 3 or more gold, which is, in my mind, always useful. That could potentially be bumped up to 2 if you are worried about economy, but that seems to be the way to go in my mind.
Yeah, needs the faction card, so it conflicts with the agenda a bit here.
Yes. Keep in mind, it conflicts with the agenda. It also does conflict with Doran Martell, and I will get to that later. There are minor conflicts here, but you don't. usually when you see one, you're happy with you know which one you want to choose in the challenges phase. But yes, you're right. It's one of the conflicting cards. And then the final events, we've got 2 copies of his Viper Eyes. Now this is a very I guess these 2 slots here are very flexible in my mind. Lately, I've been using Viper Eyes just because you've got a bit of return to hand tech. You can, I know it only works on defense, but you can be forcing some opponents to attack you with Fowler Twins, but that's a very minor interaction here. Viper Eyes is just generally a very good event for 0 gold. And it can get rid of those key cards and can actually help with some of the issues that this deck faces, which I can get into later, basically being, opponent having better control than you do. And the final 2 cards is one of my favorite events in the game, Doran's Game. That just works here as one of the win conditions, along with the Red Viper. And when you start seeing some of the right cards, for example, obviously the Red Viper himself, you start seeing Doran Martell, where you can remove an opponent from a challenge. Same thing with Area Hotar. You start finding Dawn, you start finding Hotar's Axe, you start finding those cards that are going to boost your strength and make sure you can fairly easily win by 5. This event here is a bit of a no-brainer. You do have that very minor window that you sort of need to find the card when you're around 4 to 5 use plots. So that is the one downside of this event at this point. But I did notice that this deck here, it has the control. It doesn't so much have a very clear win condition. And so I made those win conditions Doran's Game and the Red Viper. So that's why that's in there. If you manage to find a different win condition in this deck, you can probably cut Doran's Game, but it fills a fairly good role here in this deck.
Yeah, it's always a problem for me in control decks to find something to gain power quickly. So I was going to ask you, there's well, not recently released, but one of the design team cards that deals with this icon control. I forget the name, so it's a House Korga location.
Sandstone.
Sandstone, right? So
yeah.
Is there any chance that you would be able to make that work in this deck?
I would say yes. There is definitely a chance. I actually, when that card first came out, I actually experimented it with this deck, and I found that the scenarios where it worked was realistically it was only when I found both the Red Viper and when I found enough icon control, and preferably challenge pull as well. So it required it required the Red Viper and for me to both have a really established icon control board and an established challenge pull board for that event to be able to earn me realistically any power. Whilst Doran's Game was sort of doing that without requiring the icon control aspect and the challenge pull aspect. But it just does work with Red Viper, but it also works with everyone else. It's a bit harder to win, to have low icon characters in the challenge, especially when they see Sandstone. Like they see that on the board, they're not going to defend with their low icon characters if they know they're going to lose it, because what's the point of just giving you free power? So it was a very telegraphed location. Hopefully, if there's any more icon control introduced, it might be more and more useful, or more specifically, surprise icon control, as I mentioned before. But at this current moment, it wasn't making the cut, unfortunately. But you could definitely try it out.
But I agree. I also had the feeling that it tends to be win more, and or can be played around very well by the opponent. So yeah, if I have everything in there and have sort of the morning to draw them in against their will, and I can win anyway, then I probably will win the game anyway, and I'll still just not oppose. So I think it's actually a nice design, but it hasn't found its place, I think, yet for Martell.
Yeah, not yet, but hopefully soon. And so that should be, again, 6 events. I don't know if we can miss any of those. There was a small amount of events there.
No, we're fine. That's 75 cards.
Fantastic. All right, so that's the bulk of the deck. You can sort of see what it's doing there. And so a lot of the plots now. they try to fill in my mind, fill in a few of the gaps of this deck, as well as just helping a little bit with the control aspect. But the plot line here, as I mentioned, it's the last thing I've mentioned here. You can work with quite a few plot lines, as we mentioned before uh, with Locked Away. You can go with a plot line that gives you gold, you know, during the plot phase itself to utilize like Valyrian Steel triggers in different phases, and that's 100% viable. The way that I found that it worked was not relying on those cards and trying to find cards that synergize with that. It just freed up a lot of space in my deck, and so a lot of these are fairly standard plots. Um, we'll start off with the very staple Martell plot, and from Martell Opener, we've got Prince Doran's Behest. That's for very obvious reasons. It's primarily adding one extra use plot. It's going to help you're very likely to see Water Gardens early on because of 3 copies of it. So being able to immediately reduce itself, the cost of playing itself is always a big plus. And it does also work with Dawn. It does also work with Doran's game. Um, Following that, your actual opener, I guess, would be I've found a lot of use with the Maiden. So a very standard opener nowadays. Um, the reason here is it's because it's a control deck. There are different moments in this game where you want to go second, and there are different moments in this game where you want to go first. The moments where you want to go second is where you have more control available. So you have all those icon control attachments. You have Dawn Martell. You have um, Fowler Twins, for example, and you want your opponent to be able to put his board out before you put yours out. That's a very obvious thing with control. You like to go second. In the scenarios where you like to go first is when you start to see those key cards like the Red Viper and Sword of the Morning and Alaria Sand, where you can then use your own form of attacking to control your opponent's board. So in those scenarios, you want to go first. But something like the Maiden giving that +2 initiative is just always going to be useful in this scenario for you to have a lot of agency on when you go first and when you go second. Um, this plot can be swapped out with something like Time of Plenty, if that works as well. An extra card for draw is always good, but I've found currently that the Maiden is just doing a better job.
Okay, so you're
And
always going Behest into Maiden. There's no choice depending on what the opponent does. I know some Martell decks, they have a combination. They could have, for instance, Naval Superiority, or they could have Summer Harvest if they run into Late Summer Feast or something like that.
yeah, no, you're not really reacting to your opponent's starting plot. There are small scenarios where you can flip into a different plot from Behest, but 9 out of 10 times you're going to be flipping into the Maiden because it's also just 6 gold is always useful. And following an additional reason why it's useful is you're also running 1 copy of the Smith. I feel like this one's fairly obvious. Turning a lot of your passive attachments into location control. And because of the Maiden, it's turning it into a 6-6-1-6 plot, which is, as everyone would probably agree, is really good stats. And yeah, one thing to always note with the Smith, and this is just a general rule with the Smith, make sure you trigger the Smith first. Cancel your opponent's economy if you can. Otherwise, they do get that action window to kneel their economy. If you marshal a card, they then are meant to have an action window to kneel their economy. So the first thing you always want to do is kneel their economy if you have it available. Next, we'll go into Late Summer Feast. Now, this is one of your big economy plots. It's also another one that you could flip into first turn after Behest. The main reason for that is you have those big characters. If you find, for example, a duped 2 copies of Doran Martell in your hand on turn 1, flipping into a Late Summer Feast and starting that, form of control early on is always going to be beneficial for you. You can always delay the Maiden by 1 turn. It's not a big deal. It wouldn't have really been helping you with Late Summer Feast either anyway, because 2 initiative is still fairly low. So going Behest, Late Summer Feast, and Maiden is still perfectly viable here. It's also got the downside of up to you in a challenge, losing opponent draws a card. You can just ride out that turn and just not do anything. Your Martell, you've got Dawn, you've got Viperize, you can lose challenges and not be too upset about it. You've also got Lingering Venom, of course. So, yeah, that's a very staple economy plot here. We then follow up with another card that's filling the gaps, being Exchange of Information. This is the restricted choice here, and it's been competing with me. It's been competing with Secret Schemes as draw. Lately, I've simply found Exchange of Information has been more consistent for me. With Secret Schemes, a lot of the time it's actually been just sitting in my hand because I've found the economy, and so Valyrian Steel has been acting as my draw, and I've sort of just been sitting on that copy of Secret Schemes and not really finding a whole lot of use out of it. I'd be finding more use out of using the faction Neil for Valyrian Steel. So, and with Secret Schemes, I didn't really find much use having one copy of that. I'd want to have at least 2 or 3. So instead, I decided let's cut that, try out Exchange of Information. You have a decent, I know you have obviously more attachments than events or locations, but you still have a fairly even spread of card types. And keep in mind as well that anything that finds you an attachment is always good because that converts into economy or draw. So this is again one of those cards. Just makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's almost guaranteed to get 3 here. It's unlikely to get 4 with only 6 events, but to miss on any of the other card types would be really unfortunate statistically, I think.
Definitely, yeah. And realistically, like Exchange of Information, a lot of the cards here you're happy to find. So being given anything by your opponent is always good. Our second last plot is then, and this one is a bit of it could work, and I found that it's worked, but I can see reasoning as to why it couldn't, being Mad King's Command. Now, I've noticed with Mad King's Command, it's been very useful when you can have, similar to Exchange of Information, when you can have a very even spread of card types, more specifically being characters, attachments, and locations. In this scenario here, whenever I've used Mad King's Command, it's almost always hurt my opponent a lot more than it's hurt me. I have usually had to get rid of an attachment or 2, but it's usually a fairly easy choice for me. Additionally, if I choose my opponent to go first, I can know what characters they're not keeping, and so I can just simply, not choose those attachments. They'll go to the bottom of the deck, but, they weren't going to be utilized anyway if it's not on that character. And with Mad King's Command and Maiden, you're at 8 initiative, so you usually can choose that first player on that turn. Otherwise, it's then just another high initiative plot to go first. If you find the Red Viper with good attachments on him, having him and 2 other characters, like if you have him, Doran Martell, and even an Ariane Sand, something as simple as that, you're usually going to have a better turn than your opponent. And importantly, having 3 characters on their board is now only 3 characters that you have to control. So, for example, if you have Sword of the Morning in play, you've immediately controlled his entire board. Obviously they need the icons, but point being that there's those challenge pool cards, there's those icon control cards, there's those control cards. They're going to have a bad time being narrowed down to 3 characters. Additionally, on top of that as well, you have the added draw from Valyrian Steel to fairly easily get your cards back after that point. So being narrowed down to 3 cards at hand can be a struggle in some scenarios, but you usually hold that for when you've been focusing a bit on economy with Valyrian Steel and you're going to be hitting Mad King's Command soon. You play ahead and you don't really feel the hit. So that's the reset of the plot. It's working fairly well. The last card is a bit of a flex plot in my mind. Lately, I've been slotting it in with Close Call. The reason for that, is fairly straightforward. If a Doran Martell or a Red Viper or a key character of yours gets killed, Close Call is going to get them back. get them back into the game, hopefully you need to draw another copy of them, which is very possible with the amount of draw this deck does put out. It's also giving you an extra card, but yeah, there's a lot of options for this last plot. I know some people have chosen the long plan is also like a useful one, but that's only if you feel things like economy, or if you're running with that, having gold during the plot line, then cards like long plan makes more sense. But yeah, there's a lot of options for that plot, but I found this one has been very useful lately. And I believe that should be all 7 plots.
Yeah, looks nice. Okay, so this is you said you described this as a control deck, so you would usually then expect the game to go long, close to time, for instance, in a tournament setting.
Yes, yeah, that would be the case here. It's a control deck until you find your key cards, essentially. So the quicker you can find those cards, the quicker your game's going to usually go. Uh, but you're right. It's you will be battling for time a little bit in an actual tournament scenario.
And so, what are you good against with this deck, and against what kind of decks do you struggle?
Yes, so I'll start with the struggles. You definitely struggle. I think this might be a bit obvious. You struggle against decks like Night's Watch Anything. The amount of no attachments except weapon that they have, or no attachments in general, it eliminates like half of your attachments from even being really usable. They also have some decent cards, especially lately, like Great Ranging and all that, which they have. They're able to control your board a lot quicker than you can. And if you combine that with some other cards like so Jeremy Riker, for example, they have the icon boost that they need in the current big Night's Watch deck that it's just difficult to control their side, especially without being able to put attachments on those cards. It also does struggle a bit with if you're, as I mentioned earlier, if your opponent has better control than you do. So, for example, if key cards like Dawn, Martell, Red Viper, if they get Milk of the Poppy and you don't manage to find your save cards, for example, being Sweet Sleep or even an emergency mission in Essos, that can also be used in a way to combat those forms of control. Then you know your opponent's going to be beating you in that scenario because you can't use your big forms of control. And although the deck itself isn't actively used a lot, I know Targaryen with what is it, the shadow of their shadow card, their shadow event, sorry.
Shadow of the
Um,
Shadow of
East.
the East.
Shadow of the East, that's it. Shadow of the East has it just completely obliterates this deck. For fairly obvious reasons. Getting rid of those key cards at key moments is just, yeah, it doesn't do well for you. But luckily, you don't see those decks at the moment too much. Yeah, I would say its strengths necessarily would be um, decks that have a lot of key unique characters. This just completely overrides a lot of them. So you've got those. So, for example, like the classic Lannister, I know it's not played as much, but just as an example, the classic Lannister, like Tywin, Cersei, Jaime, being able to prevent those characters from participating in very key challenge types, for example, with 7 cost Cersei, preventing her in an intrigue challenge, just shuts down that entire deck with like 1 or 2 cards that you use in this deck. It then just gives you a chance to, build up, find your cards, and then just win. Um, it would also work fairly well in scenarios where I know this might be a bit obvious, but where your opponent doesn't have a lot of tricons. That's been a
Right.
that's been a that's been a bit of a thing recently. There's been a few more tricons in the game being added that has just hurt icon control in general. Um, so we've got if you're versing a Martell mirror matchup, for example, there's Tattered Prince. If you find, Greyjoy generally are hard to work with because they've got Asher, they've got Euron that you usually see in the same deck. That's both copies of Euron. Um, so it gets a bit harder at those points, but realistically, it's all a matter of whether you find those key attachments, and really whether you find attachments at all, because the attachments are generating you more cards if you need them. There's been many scenarios where I've versed a deck that I could work well against, but I've literally drawn no attachments, and it's just been a slow crawl for me to find my first attachment to start kicking off that draw, and it was too slow in that scenario. So yeah, there's I'm not as certain about the exact decks that this works super well against, and that's generally because icon removal at the moment is a bit hard to work with. So yeah, it's just in general been a fairly even deck in my mind. A lot of fun though.
All right.
Yeah, it looks nice.
Well, I know that there's if one thing I'd recommend is that if you are trying this deck out, I would play around with some other options, because this has been working very well for me, but I know it suits my playstyle fairly well. The good thing about Martell and Steel is there are a lot of options that you can branch out a little bit into, like those other attachments we mentioned. So give it a go and make some edits and see how you go. It's a lot of fun.
All right, looking forward to it. Actually, I've played icon control quite a bit over the years, but mainly it's been with the Shadows package, with the Shadows Ariane, stuff like that. So to do it with an attachment-based deck is definitely interesting, and I like this agenda. I used to love it when the original version, of course, that was just crazy draw, crazy economy, and really needed to be redesigned. But since then, kind of, I guess it's found its way in Baratheon, because they have a nice combination of negative attachments and some positive attachments that go on a lot of different characters, so it's not really a problem with the targeting restrictions. And then I think Targaryen is the other deck that you see a lot with their nice attachments package. So always interesting to find a new faction that can make use of this agenda, and this I think is kind of like Baratheon in a way, because it has a decent combination of negative and positive attachments. And then I think the most important thing becomes finding the right characters that are going to make the best use of that Sword of the Morning, for instance, or that little nice package that you have of characters that leave play on their own, so that you get to replay your stuff. So looks like it's going to be a lot of fun to play this.
Yeah, yeah, and as you said there are a few cards in here that you don't usually see played, and yeah, you'd probably know that I like if I can find a deck that utilizes cards that have been stuck in the binder for years, such as Patience, then I just find it's such an interesting deck, and your opponent doesn't expect those sort of interactions, and then they're like, oh wow, that's very interesting, I might try that. I like those sorts of decks.
Okay, so there we are. We have Martell deck for you, and thank you, Steven, for joining us today. It was an interesting episode.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to show off an interesting deck and a deck close to my heart.
All right,
Yes.
go ahead, Hannes.
So, yeah, just want to say thanks. It is always great to have Mattel Control close to my heart as well. And I definitely learned something. So thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Mia, for hosting.
Yeah, and to all of our viewers, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.